My heart was pounding with excitement as I dragged my suitcase through the familiar streets of my hometown. I hadn't told Mom and Dad I was coming home for the summer, and I couldn't wait to surprise them. I pictured their shocked faces and warm hugs as I opened the front door, but the house I was excited to come home for the summer, but when I got there, the house was quiet. No one was home. I was a little disappointed, but then I heard a voice I knew. It was Joe, my little brother. He's all grown up now. He was taller than me, and he had a big smile. We hugged, and it felt natural and easy. After a long, exhausting trip from college, I was ready. It was quiet, and I realized I was missing out on intimacy and connection. I felt disappointed, but then I heard a familiar voice. It was Joe, my little brother, all grown up. He was taller than me now, with a big smile. We hugged, and it felt so natural, so easy. After a long, exhausting journey from university, I was ready to unwind. I headed straight for the shower, letting the hot water wash away the grime and stress of the semester as the warm water cascaded over me. I finally started to relax. Once I was clean and refreshed, I slipped into a comfy summer dress and padded barefoot to my room. It felt like stepping back in time. My old posters were still on the wall, and my bed was made with my favorite sheets. It was as if I'd never left. But as I settled into my bed, I thought, I've been so focused on school and work that I've neglected my personal life. I miss the intimacy and connection I used to have. Sure, I'd been on a few dates, but nothing serious. It was hard to find time for romance in a crowded dorm room. I realized that I needed to reconnect with myself to tune into my own needs and desires. As I lay there lost in thought, I couldn't help but wonder what the future held. I traced the lines of my body, a mindless gesture, a way to ground myself. The soft fabric of my dress, the cool touch of my ski knit was a simple pleasure, a moment of peace after days of stress and deadlines. I was finally allowing myself to relax. A knock at the door startled me, my heart pounded as I scrambled to answer it. Kate, Joe's voice called out. I smoothed my dress, and I felt the soft fabric of my dress against my skin. It was a simple pleasure, a moment of peace after days of stress and deadlines. I was finally allowing myself to relax. A knock at the door startled me. My heart pounded as I scrambled to answer it. Kate, Joe's voice called out. I smoothed my dress and opened the door. Something was off. Joe, usually so carefree, looked troubled. He hesitated in the doorway, then stepped inside. He sat on the edge of my bed, running a hand through his hair. I waited patiently, giving him space to speak. Finally, he started to talk. His voice was hesitant at first. He told me about his girlfriend. Joe opened the door, and something about him seemed different. Usually so carefree, he looked troubled. He hesitated in the doorway, then stepped inside and sat on the edge of my bed, running a hand through his hair. I waited patiently, giving him space to speak. Finally, he started to talk, his voice hesitant at first. He told me about his girlfriend, a girl I'd heard him mention before. I'd always pictured them as the perfect young couple, happy and carefree, but things weren't as idyllic as they seemed. He described the constant arguments, the little things that turned into big problems. He felt like he could never do enough to make her happy, the relationship. It was like he was trying to do everything he could to make her happy, but it was all too much for him. He used to be the source of joy, but now he was just a burden. I couldn't help but notice how much he'd changed. He wasn't the same boy I used to babysit. He had a quiet maturity and depth of feeling that I remembered. His physical transformation was striking too. He was taller, broader-shouldered, and carried himself with a newfound once a source of joy. He had become a burden as he spoke. I couldn't help but notice how much he had changed. He wasn't the same boy I used to babysit. He had a quiet maturity and depth of feeling that I had seen before. His physical transformation was striking, too. He was taller, broader-shouldered, and carried himself with a newfound confidence. As he spoke, I found myself drawn to him in a way I hadn't expected. There was something about the vulnerability in his eyes, a raw honesty that was captivating. It was as if he'd peeled back layers, revealing a side of himself I'd never seen before. Without thinking, I reached out and pulled him into a. He had a confidence about him that I found attractive. He was vulnerable, but he was also honest, and that was sexy. It was like he was showing a different side of himself. I reached out and hugged him. It was a simple gesture, but it said a lot. We held each other, and there was a strange energy in the room. It was a mix of comfort and something more. I moved my hand to his hair and stroked it gently. His scent, a mix of cologne and sweat, filled my senses. Hug. It was a simple gesture, a silent way of saying, I understand. As we held each other, a strange energy filled the room. The air was thick with tension, a mix of comfort and something more. My hand instinctively moved to his hair, stroking it gently. His scent, a familiar blend of cologne and sweat, filled my senses. I traced the line of his jaw, the curve of his neck. Lost in the moment, our hands intertwined, a spark igniting between us. His touch was hesitant at first, but as he grew bolder, so did I. A wave of heat washed over me, a sensation I hadn't felt in a long time. We were on the brink of something, a dangerous, exciting thing. But just as things got hot and heavy, the sound of the front door broke the moment. I pulled away, and my heart was racing. The silence that followed was awkward, heavy with unspoken words. Joe and I exchanged glances, a silent apology for what could have been. My parents' excited voices pulled. But just as things got super intense, the sound of the front door broke the silence. My heart was beating super fast, and I felt flushed. The silence that followed was weird. It was like we were all holding each other accountable for something. Joe and I looked at each other, and I felt like we were saying I'm sorry, without saying the words. My parents' excited voices pulled me back to the present. Their warm hugs and questions were a nice distraction, but I kept thinking about the moment with Joe. I couldn't stop thinking about how intense his touch was and the electric charge between us. It was all too much to ignore. The rest of the evening was a blur. I laughed and talked with my family, but my thoughts I tried to distract myself, but I couldn't stop thinking about Joe. Their warm hugs and questions kept me from overthinking, but I couldn't stop thinking about that moment. I couldn't stop thinking about the intensity of his touch and the electric charge between us. It was all too much to ignore. The rest of the evening was a blur. I laughed and talked with my family, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, and I remembered every detail, the way he looked at me, the way he hesitated before touching me. It was all so vivid that night, and sleep was elusive. My mind raced, caught in a loop of what-ifs and maybes. I wondered if he was thinking about it too, if he felt the same. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I imagined all the different ways things could have gone, and it was pretty stressful. The next day was even more awkward. Every time I looked at him or talked to him, I felt all tense and nervous. I noticed every little thing he did, like the way he moved or the way he looked at me. It felt like every moment was important, like anything could happen. I tried to distract myself, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day, the connection was even more awkward. Every glance, every interaction was charged with unspoken tension. I couldn't help but notice the way he moved and looked. Every little detail seemed significant, every moment ripe with possibility. I tried to distract myself, but my thoughts kept returning to that moment. I imagined different scenarios and outcomes. What if the door hadn't opened? What if we hadn't stopped? The endless possibilities only fueled my anxiety. Later that evening, my dad joined me in the living room. He sat down beside me, a thoughtful expression on his face. The house felt strangely quiet after. I imagined all kinds of different scenarios and outcomes. What if the door hadn't opened? What if we hadn't stopped? There were endless possibilities, and they only added to my anxiety. Later that evening, my dad joined me in the living room. He sat down next to me, and I could see that he was thinking about something. The house felt strangely quiet after my parents left. The silence was deafening, and it made every little sound seem really loud. I tried to distract myself and focus on anything but the thoughts swirling in my head. But the memory of Joe's touch lingered, and it was a really uncomfortable feeling. I tried to resist, to talk myself out of it, but I couldn't. The silence was deafening, and it was hard to ignore the way my body was responding to it. I tried to distract myself, but I couldn't stop thinking about Joe's touch. I tried to talk myself out of it, but I couldn't. The anticipation was too strong. The thrill of the unknown was too tempting. Late that night, I went to Joe's room. He was asleep, breathing steadily and peacefully. I felt a surge of courage as I got into bed next to him. His body warmth enveloped me, and I felt a comforting sensation. I reached out, tracing the lines of. The anticipation was too strong. The thrill of the unknown was too tempting. Late that night, I crept to Joe's room. He was asleep, breathing steadily and peacefully. I felt a surge of courage as I slipped into bed beside him. His body warmth enveloped me, and I felt a comforting sensation. I reached out, tracing the lines of his arm. His eyes fluttered open, and surprise was etched on his face. Without hesitation, I took his hand and guided it to my leg. He hesitated for a moment, then surrendered to the moment. The night unfolded as a whirlwind of sensation and intimacy. It was raw, unfiltered, and intoxicating. There was a vulnerability in the silence, as his arm and eyes fluttered open, and he looked pretty surprised. I took his hand and guided it to my leg, and he hesitated for a second, but then he gave in. It was all about feeling and intimacy. It was raw, unfiltered, and intoxicating. There was a shared secret in the silence, and it made us closer. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Every touch, every glance, every breath was electric. We were lost in a world of our own, a silent language of desire. I leaned in, and our lips met in a passionate kiss. The intensity of the moment was intoxicating. I pulled him back onto the bed. We had a secret that made us closer, and it wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Every touch, every glance, every breath was electric. We were lost in a world of our own, a silent language of desire. I leaned in for a kiss, and our lips met in a passionate embrace. The intensity of the moment was intoxicating. I pulled him back onto the couch, our bodies intertwined. I moved over him, and I felt a surge of power and control. Every touch, every movement, was deliberate, every kiss a declaration of desire. His hands tightened on my waist, grounding him in the moment. I leaned in for a kiss, tracing the contours of his face. His eyes were half lit with passion, and they held. We got up close and personal, and it felt amazing. Every touch, every move, was on purpose. Every kiss was a sign of how much we wanted each other. His hands held me close, keeping us grounded. I leaned in and kissed him, and his eyes showed how into it he was. Every kiss felt like a dance, a connection between our bodies and souls. Everything else just disappeared, and we were just left with the two of us. It felt like time stood still as we went deeper into our connection. Every touch was a new discovery, and the intimacy was raw. His body under mine was an amazing feeling. His body was a perfect response to my touch. I felt powerful, in control, yet vulnerable and exposed. Every muscle, every curve, every breath was a silent invitation. I wanted him desperately, and the thought of pushing our boundaries further was intoxicating. But reality intruded, a harsh reminder of the world outside our bubble. When I stopped, barely able to ask if he was protected. His face showed a mix of confusion and realization. He sheepishly smiled and nervously explained it was both endearing and frustrating. How could he, a seasoned boyfriend, be so unprepared? I couldn't let the moment end. I wanted him, and I was determined. I wanted him, even if it wasn't in the way I'd originally thought. As I moved closer, I felt powerful. I would decide the terms, set the pace. His uncertain hands, his hesitant breaths, fueled my desire. This was my moment, and I planned to enjoy it. His body tensed beneath me. I felt a surge of power as I moved my body against his, tracing the contours of his body. His hands were uncertain, his breaths hesitant, and they fueled my desire. This was my moment, and I intended to savor it. Every touch, every breath, every shift was a response to my movements. I reveled in the power I held, the ability to evoke such raw emotion. I felt a surge of confidence as I kissed him. I was in control, and he was surrendering to my touch. His body was a canvas, and I was the artist. I was on a roll, and I knew it. Every touch, every breath, every shift was a response to my movements. I had him under my spell. I felt so confident. I was in control, and he was giving in to my touch. His body was a canvas, and I was the artist. Every move, every caress, was deliberate. I loved the way he responded. I loved the way his body trembled with anticipation. It was intoxicating, addictive. As the intensity grew, he started mirroring my movements. His hands, once hesitant, now moved with purpose. His breathing, I could tell he was enjoying it, and he was responding to my touches. It was like a dance, a silent conversation of desire. In that moment, time stood still. The world outside faded away, leaving only the two of us. It was intense, vulnerable, and full of raw emotion. It was all too much to take in. I was lost in the moment, caught in the whirlwind. He arched his body and closed his eyes, as if he was having an out-of-body experience. It was like a silent conversation of desire. In that moment, time stood still. The intensity, the vulnerability, the raw emotion, it was all too much to take. I was lost in the moment, caught in the whirlwind of our passion. But as the afterglow settled, reality began to creep back in. The intensity of the moment gave way to a sense of uncertainty. The exhilaration was still there, but it was tempered by a growing unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed a line. It was a line that might be difficult to undo. I looked at him, still in the moment. His eyes were closed, breathing slow and steady. I could tell he was relaxed, and I was too. But there was something else going on beneath the surface. I said, "You're not a virgin, right?" My voice was casual, but I could tell he was surprised. He opened his eyes, and I could see a mix of. I looked at him, still in the zone. His eyes were closed, his breath was slow and steady. He looked peaceful, and I was feeling content, but something else was going on. "You're not a virgin, right?" I asked, casual but paying attention. He opened his eyes, showing a mix of confusion and curiosity. Then, without hesitation, he nodded, saying no. He admitted it, his voice barely a whisper. I felt a strange sense of disconnection. I'd expected something different, something more. It was like a piece of the puzzle was missing, a piece that would make sense of the intensity of the moment. I turned and walked away, my mind reeling. The euphoria of the experience was still fresh, but a growing unease settled in my stomach. I felt a bit uneasy, like I'd crossed a line. I hadn't even realized there was a boundary. I'd been so caught up in the moment, letting my body do the talking. But now, in the light of day, I started to question it all. Was it right? Was it wrong? I had no answers. I couldn't stop thinking about his eyes, how he'd reacted to my touch, how he'd surrendered to the moment. It was a one-of-a-kind experience, a connection like nothing I'd ever felt before, but the intensity of it all left me with a weird feeling. I was in a state of uncertainty, leaning against the wall and feeling my heart race. I had mixed feelings of excitement and guilt. I wanted to relive the moment and experience that intensity again, but as the adrenaline subsided, I felt a wave of doubt wash over me. I needed to process what had happened and understand my feelings. Was it wrong? Was it right? The more I thought about it, the more confused I became. One part of me was exhilarated, while the other felt conflicted. I was pretty torn up about it. I went back to the room, and my mind was going a million miles an hour. I knew that this night was going to change me, no matter what. The intensity of the experience had left an indelible mark on me. As I thought about the events of the night, a question came up: was this right? I really wanted answers and validation. I wasn't alone, was I? I thought that someone else must have felt this way too, with a mix of hope and trepidation, I decided to share my experience, seeking guidance and understanding.